Kia ora, ko Margaret Milne toko ingoa, and as part of the knowledge exchange each year, InterRAI New Zealand offers a scholarship to an emerging researcher, primarily so they can attend this day and present as well. And this year it is my absolute pleasure as GM of InterRAI New Zealand to have the task of awarding this emerging research scholarship to Julie Daltrey. And Julie, if you'd like to come up, and while you're coming up, I'll just tell them a little bit about you. So Julie is a professional teaching fellow at the Faculty of Medical and Health Science School of Nursing, University of Auckland, and I confess I didn't memorise this, so I am reading it. In her own words, she was a late bloomer, so after starting nursing at age 30, she became a nurse practitioner by 2015 and helped set up the NZNO College of Gerontology Nurses. Became a gerontology clinical lead for Te Tahu Hauora Health Quality and Safety Commission, co-authored the 2023 edition of the National Frailty Care Guides, set up a nursing specialty post-grad course in frailty for aged care nurses at the University of Auckland, started working as a research fellow for Professor Burholt's Promoting Continence and Dementia project and enrolled in a PhD. And her PhD, you've been busy. Her PhD is developing a deterioration early warning system, DEWS, to support staff in residential aged care to recognise and respond to acute deterioration in the people living in care. So please help me in congratulating Julie for being our recipient this year. Sorry, paparazzi. Would you like to say anything, Julie?
Just thank you so much. It was just an honour and a surprise, really, to be given this award. That one? Awesome. All right. Oh, I see. Oh gosh, I've even got to look at myself. That's terrible, isn't it? Yeah, just a real honour. Thank you so much for giving me this award. It's not until you hear it in a paragraph that you realise you have actually done something. I am kind of in the last year or so of my PhD, I feel like I've done nothing, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, we'll get there. So thank you. May have to, yeah. Awesome. Alright, so kia ora koutou, ko Monsa Michelle Te Manga, ko Thames Te Awa, ko Ngāti English tuku iwi, ko Kupa Tauku Hapu, ko Julie Daltrey Tauku Ingoa, as you've already heard. I am originally from the UK, but I have been here since the millennium. I have got a Kiwi passport and I do think of this place as home. So I am just, it's cool. So this piece of research is part of my DEWS work, hence the lovely picture here of dew on the grass. But it's only a small part of it. So this is phase one of the research in developing a deterioration early warning system. And you don't do this stuff alone. So you can see those first three people on the line there are the supervisors of my PhD. And this particular part of the study, using the InterRAI data, I had support from a statistician, Jen Kong, from somebody who's really interested in frailty in InterRAI, Catherine Bloomfield, I'm sure you know. And we used Heather McLeod's data set. So it was a secondary analysis of data that already exists. So why were we looking at the clinical indicators that are in InterRAI? Well, because in residential aged care, if you want to identify deterioration, you kind of need to know what are the markers, and not only what are the markers, but what are the really important markers of acute deterioration. And we know if we found some of those, we could probably, if not reduce admissions to ED, we could do some work around reversible stuff. And if people are in that dying phase, we may be able to identify that a little bit earlier, which gives us that window of opportunity to do some really great nursing care. Sounds really straightforward and lovely, doesn't it? But it's actually not easy. So we know that combination of being old, so we know people move into res care, they're at least 83 years old on average. We know they're multiple comorbid and we know they have frailty because we have this barrier to get into aged care, so they have to be these things. And the challenge with that is it means when people do deteriorate, and I mean acute deterioration, not chronic deterioration, they present in really atypical and non-specific manner, which means it can be quite hard to identify. So we were really trying to identify what were the indicators and how important were those indicators. So what did we do? We shared Heather McLeod's database, which was really lovely, but we didn't need the whole thing. That database links 16 different data sets together and we didn't need all of that. So we used the hospital admission database, the ED database, the mortality collection, and the InterRAI long-term care facility assessment tool because we were interested in people living in aged care. We weren't interested in people living at home. So first of all, we had to decide, so what is acute deterioration? This is a definition from the American Medical Directors Association. It's a really nice definition. It's quite old now, but it kind of does the job. And it's nice because it talks about deterioration in multiple health domains, which links really nicely with what's the health domains that you assess in InterRAI. And we're talking about a deviation here that causes significant harm or causes death. So we decided the best way we could pull that piece of information from the data sets that we had was to say if people went to ED, were admitted to hospital or died, within 7 days of their last completed LTCF, they were probably acutely unwell. And we could compare that group of people to a group of people that didn't go to ED or die within 7 days of the InterRAI assessment. So that was our definition of acute deterioration. That's how we found it. We then needed to decide what clinical indicators we're going to look at. As you'll be aware, there are multiple clinical indicators or signs and symptoms that you could look at in InterRAI. And we kind of needed to narrow that down a little bit so that we could do some statistical analysis. The way we did that was to go to the literature and have a look at literature that were eyewitness accounts of signs and symptoms of clinical deterioration in aged care. There's a couple of really big studies that gives you about 16,000 nurse-observed examples of acute deterioration, where they literally tick a set of signs and symptoms, all the ones that applied. So we know that they're eyewitness accounts. We wanted that rather than the ED end, because by the time you get to the ED end, diagnosis of change, we wanted a set of symptoms. So we looked at that. We also looked at what deterioration tools are out there in aged care land, and what are the signs and symptoms that they use for acute deterioration. We took all of that data and we matched across to the absolute best that we could to the InterRAI marker and the LTCM. And obviously we were most interested in the worst outcome level. So that meant that we were actually able to match 46 indicators of acute deterioration. We did some, and this is the cohort, just so that you've got some idea. For the people that did experience acute deterioration and the people who didn't experience acute deterioration, according to our definition. So in total, out of that group, we had about 5,000 people and about 10% of them had an acute deterioration event. When you looked at them demographically, they're pretty darn similar. There was no statistical significant difference in any of the demographics between the two. All right. So what did we do? We took those 46 indicators and we did a regression analysis on each individual one to have a look and see what was the association between the clinical sign and acute deterioration. On here, I've just listed the ones with an odds ratio above 3, because nobody wants to look at 40 clinical indicators. And quite frankly, 40 clinical indicators, as nice as it is to find 40, in terms of clinical practice, are pretty hopeless. Nobody wants 40 things to look at. So. And you can see on here that there are indicators from each domain of health. So there are cognitive ones, there are behavioural ones, functional, physical ones. So that's really nice because that matches that definition of acute deterioration of people that live in aged residential care. But some of them are not so helpful, because like if you look at fever, there are only 4 people in Avery, you can't rely on that kind of information. So it was some nice variety, but there were 40 of them. Because all 40 were statistically significant, we took all 40 and put it into a multivariable regression analysis. And this is where we ended up. Fortunately, there were only 9 left. So 9's cool because you can do something with 9. 9 means you could actually apply it to practice. There is again at least one variable from every domain of health. So again, that was quite reassuring. And the numbers in each variable are quite high, given that we only had 500 people in the deterioration group. These are not bad proportions of the people in that group. There is a bit of a sitter there that I'm sure people that like numbers have looked at already and said, well, how come time of sleep during the day has got an odds ratio of 8 and everything else is about 1.5 to 2? We think there's a couple of reasons for that. Our data set included people that had died. When you look at the literature, other people that have done similar work have done this on people that have transferred to ED. So you don't transfer to ED people that have already died, so they're not in their data set. If you look at their data set, the odds ratios on average come up as about 4. We've come up as about double. The other thing we did was we ran it again, but without the sleep variable in to see if it made a difference. And it actually made hardly any difference. By taking that out, all we did was add an additional confusion variable. So we decided to keep it in because it's the closest variable available in InterRAI that talks about level of consciousness. And if you want to talk about delirium, you want to be talking about confusion and you want to be talking about changing level of consciousness. So we decided to. These are pretty much independent variables. We did a VIF to measure multicollinearity. It's just a measure of how independent are the variables. If your VIF comes out as 1, you're good to go. There's none of them are correlated. And our highest was 1.3. And they reckon between 1 and 5 is kind of a moderate multicollinearity. So they're pretty good, really. And they kind of have a sense of feeling okay, don't they? Confusion, an older person's gone off their food, they've changed their way that they do their day-to-day activities and they're falling over. Wouldn't be a surprise to anybody in aged care if you told them that these were important variables. There are some limitations, of course, there always are when you do this stuff. There's a lot of people in aged care who become acutely unwell, get treated by their GP and never hit an emergency department and are not dying. Or not dying in that particular moment. So there's a whole bunch of people that we don't know anything about because there is no national database for primary care. This is a relatively old database, right back at the beginning when in 2005 when InterRAI was being introduced. And we know that people got better. So there could be some data anomalies in there. And we couldn't match every marker that is written in the literature. We couldn't match everyone to the InterRAI. So there were some pieces missing. Yeah. The one thing that kind of raises questions for us that we haven't answered is how come 500 people were having an InterRAI assessment 7 days before they died, went to hospital or went to ED? Is it because there isn't any other better tool out there, like the deterioration early warning system, or is it something else going on? We don't know the answer to that, but it does raise a really interesting question. So what? Well, there are a few studies around that actually quantify the relationship between the markers of acute deterioration and how it increases the risk of going to ED or acute deterioration. There are only 9 in our study, which actually means it's quite useful. And this idea that non-specific symptoms and atypical symptoms are actually really important markers in frail older people when they deteriorate is actually becoming being picked up internationally. There's a lot of work going out of Sweden at the moment And ED clinicians are starting to say this non-specific atypical kind of presentation is a red flag for older people that come into ED, which is just warms the cockles of my heart, really. So what can we do with this? Well, we think that this is evidence to support a deterioration early warning score, being as they're only 9, they're practical, and being as they're all observable. You don't have to do anything to the resident to actually assess any of these. So that home-like environment in aged care can continue to be maintained while people do this kind of assessment. So we think this is the basis of a track and trigger kind of approach. And kind of moving on from here, because it is my PhD study and it's been ongoing, we went on to do a qualitative piece of work to check whether those markers were important in clinical practice as well as on InterRAI data, and we had some pretty good matching.
We've got lots of time for the question. When you can come and interview me. I saw a patient about a month ago referred to old age psychiatry service for behavioural concerns. And I went to see him. He was asleep during the day. And anyway, we put together this non-pharmacological intervention, but actually he was dying. A week later, he died. So there is some faith validity there. No. So we come in. Good. Now we've got some questions. Sarah? Oh, do you want to use the thingy, please?
You mentioned, is that working? Okay. You mentioned about delirium and, you know, hypoactivity as well as hyperactivity. Do you think we should be including something like the 4AT, given that we know that delirium is also associated with hospitalisation, ED admission, death, you know, increased expenses, etc.? Just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Including it in what? Sorry.
And well, we've gone on.
Thank you. I was actually going to say in the needs assessment, but as you say, that's maybe not appropriate. So maybe we should be introducing it in care homes as, you know, part of the whole package.
So there's a challenge here, of course, because what I've done is used long-term assessments from InterRAI to give me some window into acute deterioration. So that's a bit hard to say, really, because we have used InterRAI data for something that wasn't really designed to do. But because we said, because they're dying within 7 days, then I think some of those markers might be reasonable. As far as the dues is concerned, we haven't used the 4AT because we invented a completely new tool. But absolutely, delirium is part of it. So those changes, hypo and hyperactivity, as well as the confusion signs, are absolutely all in there.
And just because what I find clinically, I'm an old age psychiatrist as well, is that people just get taken straight to ED, which of course is the worst place. They get more and more confused. And in fact, often it's something that could actually be treated in the care home if the staff there were kind of given the competency and confidence to be able to treat with some antibiotics for their UTI or whatever. But it's an educational issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So the coming plan of my research is the step before that, really. So it's the step to give people a really standardised and systematic way of confirming people are unwell as early as possible, so they can have a good conversation with the GP or the NP about what to do next, and absolutely try and avoid that whole, I'm now in ED, I've been sat there for 5 hours, I'm now dehydrated, I'm even more confused. So trying to get that care as close to the person's home as possible.
Question 4AT, what are those items? Just wonder whether they're already embedded in InterRAI.
One of the key items is there a change from usual, which is picked up by the caregivers who know them probably more powerfully than the other things, which is a couple of cognitive questions and orientation and months backwards.
Age, date of birth, orientation question.
Right.
But I think it's the observation of change that does the work in this setting. And what we want is a simple observational tool, which choose is so that the caregivers can be empowered to say something is wrong and different, do something. And that's the next step where you might use something more objective to do things, as long as you've got timely primary care, which is obviously a huge problem.
The other comment is really about strength.
The strength of the gut. The other key thing is the strength of the gut feeling that something is different, and this empowers that feeling. Very important. And it's the narrative that counts, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. One of the things that really came through strongly when we did the qualitative interviews of the staff was this: we know when something is wrong. So this whole sense of knowing, and how in aged residential care there is a relationship that develops. It's a whānau-like or a facility family-like relationships that enables that knowing, and that knowing is kind of a really key clinical indicator and is part of this work.
That's really outstanding work. I'm so impressed with what you've done, the approach you've taken, and the way you've focused on things that are important. Of course, we can't do a whole LTCF assessment every time we think someone might be deteriorating. So what are we going to do? Historically, InterRAI internationally has been not keen, in fact, doesn't allow slicing assessments, taking bits out, doing bits, for reasons that it very easily moves into whole sorts of misuse and misunderstandings, and people think they can shortcut it. However, a decision was made, actually in New Zealand, by the InterRAI International Board, was that we could allow for partial assessments in a situation where people are having regular full assessments. So if you're in an art facility, of course, having regular full assessments. So in that context, it is allowable to think about. We don't want to just say, go ahead and do it. We have to talk to the team, Gabe particularly, about how that's possible. But is there a model to allow for a partial assessment using the actual InterRAI data items? The reasoning for that would be, of course, they have an iterative reliability assessment, and that's the ones you used for this thing. So that's something worth thinking about, talking to the team here as an opportunity. And you know, InterRAI internationally always wants to look at new ways of looking at things. So I don't think it's just your PhD. You have an opportunity to engage in a wider. So well done, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a really interesting thought. The challenge would just be about how frequently, wouldn't it? Each care. But, yeah.
Julie, it's really exciting what you're doing, and I think about some of the things that are in the urgency of life, and a change in mental status, that if the person assessing understands what that means, can be a good indicator for picking up delirium. It'll trigger the delirium care. The chess score that will pick up that massive instability. So the items in the actual chess outcome scale that will pick through those physical and cognitive changes that will is a very good indicator of somebody being at risk of death if there is an intervention. But as they said, we don't want to be doing a full LTCF in an acute environment. So the opportunity to develop something that works in with that and is reliably researched is very, very exciting. And we would love to be seeing more and working with you around. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was something unexpected.
I think the strength of this tool is really got nothing to do with using the long-term care InterRAI pool. This is something that you need to do, that you need to train your caregivers and your nurses to be watching out for on a daily basis. And there may be more to gain by embedding these observations into the electronic record of the care home on a daily basis. I think that comes first rather than trying to use the InterRAI more regularly. Yeah, well, I'm just reinforcing it because we haven't got the time to do the other stuff. It distracts from the quick, what the hell's going on assessment that you need after you've observed the change that you've identified so beautifully in your 9 points.
And thank you for that too. Yeah, the time is always of the essence in this environment, isn't it? And, you just bring to mind that word electronic. So currently everything we have is on paper because everything's not finalised and who wants to go into a digital world with stuff that isn't finished. But that whole electronic connection thing and automatic alerts and all of that would be, you know, kind of a piece of future work as well. Thank you for that.
You may have mentioned it, sorry, Julian, I might have missed it, but I'm just curious if that 513 people that were your cohort that you modelled, what proportion actually recovered and went back to the home after their ED visit, and what proportion died?
That's a good question. We didn't look at the individual outcomes of the ED visit. We just looked at did they go or didn't they go. It's cross-sectional analysis.
Because I would sort of
Yeah.
what you think? I would.
To be honest, no, because what we're trying to do is identify that moment of acute deterioration. The pathway may be reversible. The pathway may be that it's not reversible, or the pathway may be that it is reversible, but they don't want treatment. And that's not really the point. The point is to identify it in the first place to give you that window of opportunity to do something.
I respectfully disagree. I think they're quite different pathways. If you identify that someone has a reversible cause that could be treated and they want to be treated versus you're identifying someone who's actually dying, I think they're quite different cohorts. Just a bit closer. Thank you. Sorry.
We won't invite Catherine to your exam. Last question, Nare.
Oh, I think it's a comment really, and it follows on nicely from Kathleen's point. So this acute deterioration thing needs the next step necessarily is an evaluation of what to do. And so I think we should go tell all the GPs and NPs and all of the people who are working in aged care about this very simple way. Because anecdotally, I've heard lots of stories of, oh, we kind of rang up the GP, but, you know, they didn't do anything. So that coverage of the next response, I think, is your next piece of work.
So we have just recruited 6 residential aged care facilities to test the views. So I'm working with the Health Quality and Safety Commission to do that. And we have just this week had the very first conversations with GPs that support those facilities. So hopefully.
I'm happy to help with those conversations.
Thank you.
I'm an RE in a nursing home, West Home in Wakefield, Nelson. And the key point into identifying all these conditions in people is having the adequate staffing on the floor, okay? At the moment, these corporates don't have adequate staffing on the floor. The carers are not taken seriously. The RNs disregard their information and their knowledge of the resident. So picking up malaria is going to be quite remote. So the key is the government's got to give you more money to put more staffing on the floor so you can pick up these deteriorations in people.
Thank you for your comments.